Let me say a few words about these two, you can say, architects of the path which we follow, CHO lineage. Let's start with the relationship with Machik Labdron and Padampa Sangye. This is one of the most significant and nuanced connections, you can say, in the history of Tibetan Buddhism, primarily centered on the transmission of CHO lineage. While their historical relationship is often debated by scholars, it is generally defined by three primary dimensions. A little bit confusing, so I just want to lay out those three kinds of, or three dimensions of relationship, Machik Labdron and Padampa Sangye. First of all, teacher and student relationship. Many traditional accounts, Padampa Sangye, as you know, the 11th century South Indian Mahasiddha, is regarded as one of Machik Labdron's primary teachers. She has a few primary teachers, but one of them. He is credited with introducing the CHO, that's the Tibetan term, pacification of suffering teaching, to Tibet. He was Indian, right? Then he came to Tibet and he introduced this particular teaching to Tibet. So according to these hagiographies, Padampa Sangye recognized Machik's high level of realization and transmitted the key instructions to her. It is often said that while Padampa Sangye brought the male CHO, just as we meditated on, male CHO, CHO, and Machik Labdron developed a female CHO, Mahamudra CHO. We are studying in other journeys programs, which became the more prominent and widely practiced form, as we all know. So that's the one relationship, teacher and students relationship. Then second dimension in terms of relationship is the spiritual equalities and collaborators. Some traditions emphasize a relationship of mutual respect, not like a hierarchical thing. There are account of the two meetings in the historical text and engaged in the Dharma combat, Dharma debate, or spiritual debate to test each other's realizations. This debate is not competition, just to test each other to develop their realization. In these narratives, Padampa Sangye famously praised Machik, acknowledging that her wisdom and her method of opening the door to the sky, this is a CHO practice, right, were unique and profound. This way, Padampa Sangye and Machik Labdron were equally respected and collaborated for the development of the CHO tradition, you can say. Then third dimension is the consort, the tantric relationship. In certain esoteric and secret biographies, each masters have a secret biography or the more historical biography. There are many different levels of biography. The secret biography is described as a tantric consort. From this perspective, their union was not a worldly partnership, but a spiritual method used to accelerate enlightenment and ground the CHO traditions in the union of wisdom and skillful means. Those three primary dimensions are described in general. So regardless of the specific nature of their personal bond or relationship, their collaboration resulted in a unique synthesis of Indian and Tibetan thought. For example, philosophical aspect, both systems are deeply rooted in the Prajnaparamita, as you know. Prajnaparamita Sutra, Buddha's teaching, emptiness teaching. Then CHO practice, their combined influence created the practice focusing on cutting through the ego by offering the body as a feast for gods and demons, transforming fear into realization, as we all know this tradition, and the lineage Today, almost all lineages trace the spiritual ancestry back to both figures, Machik and Padampa, viewing them as the dual parents of the tradition. We are very fortunate to receive both empowerment at the same occasion. I'm so happy. So now we have a sadhana as well. Now, to understand the relationship between both two, it is helpful to look at a little bit how these individuals contributed or functioned. These CHO tradition, pacification of suffering tradition, and CHO, cutting through tradition, functioned both as a kind of distinct philosophies and as a unified practice path. Yeah. So let me say a little bit about Padampa Sangye, because many of you may not know much about. He has a lot of mystical things behind his narratives. Of course, he's an 11th century Indian Mahasiddha. As I said, he developed a CHO tradition, or his main teaching. The core goal of that pacification of suffering tradition, pacifying the mental affliction that causes it. In a way, more passive. Then Machik Labdron teaching goes one step further than that. It's a cutting through, or fierce in a sense. So anyway, theoretical root, as I said, is a Prajna Paramita. Based on the Prajna Paramita, it teaches that suffering is not something to avoid it, to suppress, but something to be looked at directly until its empty nature is realized. That's the theoretical background and root. Then practical method. So that's the kind of divert from Machik and Padampa Sangye. Padampa's skillful means is very unique in a way. Have you read the translation of that collection of Padampa's teaching to the people of Dindi, village called Tindi in Tibet? These are very unique collection of his teaching and very interesting. He taught the sadhana method, shocking to the people. His sadhana method of realization, often using a pithy, direct instructions to shock the mind out of its usual patterns. He was a Mahasiddha, ascetic and unconventional, emphasizing that the practitioner should remain like a person with an incurable disease, utterly relentant on the Dharma because they have no other choice, or something like that. His teaching was very unconventional. And also his teaching emphasized the urgency of spiritual practice, the inevitability of death, and the necessity of severing worldly attachment to find the true liberation. Hopefully, we have more time to talk about this 100 verses of Padampa's teaching, people in the Dindi in Tibet. His direct way of teaching and kind of rhythmic poetry, very insightful. For example, just let me say this 5 slogans of Machik. Many of you may know 5 slogans of Machik. That was taught by Padampa Sangye. Basically, Padampa Sangye. Then Machik applied or promoted that 5 slogans. For example, go to the place that scares you, like a channel ground. That is the way how Machik developed, but that instruction came from Padampa originally. So Machik Labdron, on the other hand, took the seed of the Prajna Paramita and the CHO instructions that Padampa taught her, and developed this whole system or tradition called CHO. So this is a uniquely Tibetan development that moved from the passive pacification of suffering to the active ritualized form of cutting of the ego. Like many of us know, like experience, or we are practicing that tradition. In terms of theoretical root is, of course, as we went over, Prajna Paramita. But Machik identified the root of all demons as the self-grasping, ego, clinging, self-fixation. She taught that the demons are not the external entities, something out there and getting at you. Not like that. But rather our own thought and fear, especially fear and hopes, and then given that form. She emphasized like that, all demons are my mind. Of course, that's not new to Machik, and Buddha said that. But Machik is the one really brought up that one to apply to the practice called CHO. Then, of course, her unique method, practical unique method is this feeding the demon. Instead of fighting off negative influences, the practitioner visualize transforming their own body into a nectar and offering it as a feast to all beings, including those they fear most, those attached most. This is the ultimate, you can say, ultimate act of generosity without the self. You can see the influence of Padampa Sangye in this teaching. Padampa Sangye's, we just went over a little bit about Padampa Sangye's shocking method. Now, theoretical synthesis, you can say, theory and practice and synthesis. So relationships between their teaching are often described through the lineage and the method. Yeah, so anyway, theoretical bond. So just mentioned here the last, before we dive into the commentary, I emphasize the influence of their relationship, Padampa and Machik, felt how modern practitioners view adversity. We take adversity as something too negative or to get rid of. Before Padampa and Machik, in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, many traditions viewed obstacles like illness, mental distress, or external threat as interferences to be cleared away before one could practice. Lots of purification practice and those things are done. But then here, they kind of turn around this mind transformations, using those very challenges as a path to quicken, accelerate our awakening. Yeah, so that's the kind of things they taught, and we follow their journey, their path. Let me say one more thing, one more point there, clarify this collaboration of Padampa and Machik's bond. You can say bond or theoretical bond. Both share the same philosophical concept, emptiness, as I said. Then Padampa provides the realization of emptiness as a way to soothe the mind. That's a pacification teaching, right, basically. Then Machik transform that realization into a radical psychological tool. So in other words, without the Padampa's Indian lineage, CHO might have lacked its scriptural authority, like a Tibetan girl just develop her own things or something like that. In fact, lots of Indian yogis came to Tibet, visited Tibet, then criticized her, debated her, because they didn't trust her unique lineage. But then, as you know, all Indians were defeated by Machik, this little girl. Anyway, so that's that. Then without Machik's innovation, her unique tradition, CHO might have remained quiet, never paid attention in a sense, just end up with quiet, just contemplative meditation, rather than a dynamic popular lineage that survived to this day. Yeah, so in other words, both are important. So now we are so happy we have both sadhana and to practice. But of course, sadhana is the framework, something we don't need to solidify. All sadhana are very similar framework. Just we make a connection. We have a specific deities, in this case, Padampa Sangye and Machik. They make a connection, then acquired our own qualities within us.